Hi there folks, my name's Chris. Today I'm going to take you through the SharePoint enhancements for Nintex Workflow Cloud. Today the team launched 18 new actions and a new start event for Nintex Workflow Cloud. It makes up release 107. I'll go in a bit more detail into what they are, where you can find them and how you can get your hands on them. So before we have a look at the actual product, let's have a look at the release notes. Everyone should be fairly familiar with where they are. community.nintex.com, Platform Center, release notes. And select Nintex Workflow Cloud. Everything else is here as well. But this is a good place just to quickly summarize what's been rolled up into the release and subsequent releases. We're now at release number 107 for Nintex Workflow Cloud. Included the SharePoint Online Start event, its ability to trigger a Nintex Workflow Cloud workflow from a new item or an update list item within SharePoint Online on the Office 365 platform, and also 18 additional actions added to the SharePoint Online connector suite for an Nintex Workflow Cloud. So that whole create, read, update, delete, query capability within Workflow Cloud to a SharePoint Online tenant. Working with lists and libraries, so some new additions around moving documents around and document sets around, querying user profile information, adding users to SharePoint groups as an example as well. The ability to work with documents, files, so check in, check out as a fairly commonplace use case within SharePoint. Some site administration actions added as well, so the actual provisioning side, and if you're familiar with previous Nintex 4 SharePoint workflow tools, you'll know that that one's extremely commonly used, the ability to create lists, create sites, create site collections, and the inverse, so deleting and have that as part of your housekeep or offboarding use cases as well. And finally, one of the most commonly used actions in the existing stack for SharePoint is the item level permission, so update item level permissions within SharePoint. So without further ado, let's have a look at where they are in Nintex Workflow Cloud and how you can get your hands on them as well. So this is Nintex Workflow Cloud. What I have done already is added a connection. There are different types of connections for the different types of actions that you're going to use within Nintex Workflow Cloud for SharePoint. So make sure you're getting the right one. It should be fairly commonplace when you start to use the action switches. So just under the connections tab, username, password, tenant URL, and away we go. So I'm just going to go through a real quick tour. I have already got a SharePoint Online list called demo under this site already created. So this is one that I'm going to use. It already has a Nintex form attached. Now this is going to start to really come into play based off the recent announcement. Microsoft are deprecating that SharePoint 2010 workflow engine, and then in coming months will deprecate the SP 2013 engine on Office 365. So you're going to need somewhere to automate your stuff. You're going to need to build workflows somewhere, and Nintex Workflow Cloud is a really intuitive choice, or the Nintex for Workflow for Office 365. But this has definitely bolstered that capability. So we'll start with a start event up here, my little play button. And we now have a new connector, SharePoint Online. So I'll just select that. That's going to open up the different events that I can trigger an Nintex Workflow Cloud workflow form. So remember, Nintex Workflow Cloud decoupled from that underlying SharePoint environment. I can kick off a workflow on a new list item. So that essentially means when that new item has been submitted through SharePoint, it's going to then trigger a workflow. And here it's also going to pass as many variables as I wanted it to into the workflow engine. And with that new object support that's been released as well, I can actually get access to all of the columns within that SharePoint list through the object. And I don't need to declare an individual variable for each column that I want in there, which is really, really great and a huge time save. So let's say we want a new list item. It's going to open up the configuration. I've already got that connection saved, and I just need my SharePoint site URL. So I already have that. I'm just going to copy and paste that in here, like so. Select the tick. Lovely bit of introspection. It's going to show me all the available list names. Here's demo. We'll jump into that one. and then we've got the conditions upon which this workflow could start as well. So it might be something like if a date is specific or a choice is specific, then we start this workflow. Perhaps it's an emergency response workflow with a high priority and we want to start a different workflow rather than use a run if within the workflow. If I go to my show variables, this is where we'll see that start variable object. So that object is going to pull through every column name within my SharePoint list. So let's click on that, and we now have all of those columns available at my disposal. So that's also going to pass through into every other workflow action that we use, because start event is going to be available to me. So this is really, really awesome as well. This was released today. So that's my start event. The other options, obviously, as we mentioned, the update list item as well. So instead of starting on new, it's if somebody's gone in, visited an existing instance in that SharePoint list, made an amendment, let's kick off that workflow. And that's where your conditions will probably start to come in. So let's move to the actual SharePoint action pack. So SharePoint Online, this might appear slightly different in the stack depending on how you've configured your workflow engine. So let's have a look at some of the new actions. So as we said, a lot of provisioning being beefed up here, and also user interaction and user profile. So the ability to add a user to a SharePoint group. Let's have a quick look at that one because I really like this one. It's ability to add that user, select my connection, add my site URL in there, and then I can add my group. Now you'll see as I go into these different configuration options, the ability to actually insert a variable. So you can variable drive all of these options now. So rather than actually be hard coding the site URL or the list URL, I can actually have declared a variable earlier in the piece. Perhaps that's some information that's come in from a form, and I might then want to insert a variable for a subsite or a list for an instance, and that's going to become apparent in some of the other actions that we'll show you. User's email address and then the output, so the result that comes back from that action. So let's just remove that one for now and we'll jump into another action. The ability to check in and check out files. So all we're going to need here is a file name, and that's going to do that check in, check out. And there are some other conditional configurations that go in align with check in, check out. Got my site URL again. This one could be variable driven, doesn't have to be a hard coded URL such as that. And my document library as well can be variable driven, doesn't have to be the drop down. And you've obviously got things like your check in limits, how many files, include files in subfolders, your check-in versioning, major, minor, and overwrite, which if you've used SharePoint before, you should be fairly familiar with that concept. And any comments that you want to add as part of the check-in, check-out. Pretty cool. So moving on, document sets. We sort of discussed that when we looked at the release notes. The ability to create a document set now within Workflow Cloud to SharePoint Online, copying and moving files, and then your whole provisioning suite, all the way from creating items. So create an item down here, again, variable driven, sites, lists. And this is not a new action, but the concepts around sort of changing these inputs are new. They are different. So the ability to drive that from maybe constructing a URL using a set variable action earlier in the piece, or perhaps using a string, and also the list name as well, and the ability to then create metadata that goes along with that dependent on the item content type that's being used. Create a list. So if you want to create a new list in a site, the ability to do that. Create a site and create a site collection. So real sort of a holistic provisioning suite. And the inverse is true as well. Delete items, delete lists, delete sites also. So let's move on. Query user profile. That's a nice new one as well. That's the ability to query that within SharePoint and removing users from a SharePoint group. So the inverse of my add user to a SharePoint group. Really awesome. Really applicable for some of these human resources, provisioning, onboarding, offboarding examples that were being frequently asked to proof of concept. And finally, before we leave the overview, update item permissions. Now, I know personally this one's been heavily requested. A lot of customers, a lot of partners are asking to see this one in Nintex Workflow Cloud. It seems to have been sort of a barrier to really jumping into Nintex Workflow Cloud feet first, so here it is. Create my connection, add my site URL, the ability to retrieve those lists if you are hard coding that, otherwise the ability to variable drive it. Select my list name, Any conditions? So are you going to add a condition to limit those returned results? So when the actual connection queries that SharePoint list for those applicable items, are you going to restrict that? And then which different permissions are you going to apply to this item? Now these are really, really commonplace use cases around HR style or expense style, or anything that's particularly restricted by its level of privilege or level of security. Update item permissions once that item has been submitted or once that item has passed through a different stage in the workflow. Really, really applicable to use this action in there and apply that permission update to the different components to which it applies. So that's just a quick overview, quick tour of some of the new actions that have been added today. If you are a Nintex Workflow Cloud customer, they will already be applied to your tenant. So wherever in the world that is, go and enjoy these new actions. New start events, 18 new actions. So great work done by the team. And also, if you are new to Nintex or looking at this as something that we might do, perhaps you've been impacted by the news that SP 2010 for Office 365 is deprecated and going to be deprecated. Perhaps you're impacted by the potential upcoming lack of or stop of support for on-premises workflow, and you're thinking the cloud is for you. Definitely give Nintex Workflow Cloud a look. We'll give you a free trial for up to 30 days. All actions are included, all start events, and just jump on nintex.com/trial. And everything should be pretty self-explanatory from there. If you've got any other questions or you want to know a bit more about the functionality, or you want further detail, further tour, and maybe even build out a proof of concept for you, don't hesitate. Reach out to me through the normal mediums, and I'm more than happy to facilitate. But in the meantime, enjoy the new actions and all the use cases that come along with it. We're really excited about this one hitting the market and think it's a significant step forward for supporting those SharePoint Online customers.